Here's a question that should bother you more than it does. We landed on the moon with 4 kilobytes of computer memory, and then, for 57 years, not one human being went a single kilometer farther. Why? The phone on your nightstand outpowers everything Apollo ever flew. Yet Mars remains exactly as far away as it was in 1969. Tonight we're going to find out what's actually standing between us and the planets, and I promise the answer is stranger than rockets that aren't big enough. So dim the lights and get comfortable, because the real obstacle was identified by a deaf schoolteacher in 1903. Part 1. The Paradox of 2026. On April 10th, 2026, a small capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California, and inside it were 4 people who had just travelled farther from Earth than any human beings in history. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen had spent 10 days looping around the moon aboard the Artemis II mission, and somewhere out there, on the far side of our nearest neighbour, they broke a distance record that had stood since 1970. The previous record holders were the crew of Apollo 13, 3 men in a crippled spacecraft, fighting for their lives with duct tape and slide rules. Think about that for a moment. The farthest any human being has ever been from home, as of this year, is a record set by accident during an emergency more than half a century ago, and we only just barely beat it, on purpose. This past spring, 4 people flew around the moon in 2026, and it was front-page news around the world, and rightly so, but the moon is the same destination we reached in 1969. In 57 years, the radius of human experience has not grown by a single kilometre beyond it. There's a statistic that makes the pause vivid. Between December of 1968 and December of 1972, a span of just 4 years, 24 human beings travelled to the moon's distance, and 12 of them walked on its surface. Every one of them was born before 1936. For more than 5 decades afterward, the entire population of Earth lived without a single living soul venturing beyond low Earth orbit, a region that hugs our planet closer than London is to Paris. The space station, magnificent as it is, orbits at roughly 400 kilometres up, about the driving distance between 2 neighbouring cities. We became a species that could watch the planets through telescopes of astonishing power, land robots on them with balletic precision, and yet could not send a person beyond our own doorstep. Until this spring, when that finally cracked. That is the paradox at the centre of tonight's journey, and it leads directly to the question in our title. What would it actually take for us to travel between the planets of our solar system? Not once, not as a flags and footprints stunt that bankrupts a superpower, but routinely the way we cross oceans. What is actually standing between us and Mars? Between us and the moons of Jupiter? Between us and a civilization that treats the solar system as a place you can go rather than a picture you can look at? The comfortable answers turn out to be wrong, and it's worth dismantling them one by one before we build the real answer. The first comfortable answer is that we lacked the technology back then, and we're still catching up. But here's the thing, the Apollo guidance computer that navigated humans to the moon had roughly 4 kilobytes of working memory. 4 kilobytes. The phone in your pocket has millions of times more computing power than the machine that landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in the Sea of Tranquility. Mission Control backed it up with engineers wielding slide rules and pencils. Computing was never the wall. If raw processing power were the bottleneck, we'd have had colonies on Mars by 1995. The second comfortable answer is money. And money matters, but not the way people assume. At its peak, the Apollo program consumed around 4% of the entire United States federal budget, an investment so enormous that it was never going to survive past its political moment. But humanity has spent comparable sums on far less interesting things in the decades since, and the cost of reaching space has been falling for years. Money explains why we stopped. It doesn't explain why starting again is so hard. The real wall, the actual physical, non-negotiable wall, is energy per kilogram. Every kilogram you want to move through space demands a price paid in energy, and the chemistry we use to pay that price has a fixed budget that no amount of engineering cleverness can raise. Distance, meanwhile, charges an exponential fare. The Moon sits about 384,000 kilometers away, close enough that Apollo crossed the gap in 3 days. Mars, at its closest approach, is around 55 million kilometers away. That's roughly 145 times farther than the Moon. And that's the good news, because Mars is only that close for a brief window every couple of years. At its farthest, when it sits on the opposite side of the Sun, Mars is about 400 million kilometers away, a 7-fold swing depending on nothing more than the calendar. When someone asks how far away Mars is, the only honest answer is, it depends on when you ask. Numbers in the millions of kilometers slide straight off the human mind, so let's make the distance physical. 55 million kilometers is roughly 1,375 trips around Earth's equator, laid end to end. Or try it this way. If the distance from Earth to the Moon were a single step, a one stride across your bedroom floor, then Mars, at its closest, would be a football field and a half away. And Mars, at its farthest, would be most of the way down a 10th field beyond that. Apollo crossed the single step in 3 days. With the same chemistry, and as we'll see, we are still, fundamentally, using the same chemistry the football field takes the better part of a year. That is the entire problem of interplanetary travel compressed into one image. We are very good at the step, and the step taught us almost nothing about the field. Even light itself feels this distance. A radio signal reaches the Moon in about 1.3 seconds, which is why the Apollo astronauts could hold something close to a normal conversation with Houston. A radio signal to Mars takes between 3 and 22 minutes one way, depending on where the two planets sit in their orbits. Say hello to an astronaut on Mars at the wrong time of year, and you'll wait 44 minutes for the reply. There is no mission control for Mars, not really. There is only advice arriving from the past. That delay quietly redesigns the entire mission before a single bolt is drawn. Apollo 13's crew survived because hundreds of engineers in Houston diagnosed a crippled spacecraft in real time and radioed up procedures within minutes. A Mars crew in trouble gets no such lifeline by the time Houston even learns there's a problem. The crew has been living with it for up to 22 minutes, and the considered reply is another 22 behind that. So the ship must carry what the radio cannot: the diagnostic manuals, the spare parts, the medical skills, the authority to decide. Every kilometer of distance converts mission control into mission consultation, and converts the crew from pilots into something closer to a small, self-governing civilization. Keep that thought, it returns, with teeth, later tonight. So that's the wall. But here's why tonight's question is being asked now, in 2026, rather than at any other moment in those 57 years. Because for the first time since Apollo, you can actually watch the pieces of the answer being assembled. As of late May, the largest rocket ever constructed has flown 12 times. 7 of those flights succeeded, 5 failed, and the most recent one, on May 22nd, was the first flight of an entirely new version of the vehicle, one built with docking ports and plumbing designed for something no one has ever done: transferring rocket propellant from one ship to another in orbit. In March, in an industrial unit in Bletchley, England, a small company switched on the first plasma inside a system designed to one day become a fusion rocket. And in February, the most aggressive Mars timeline in the world was publicly pushed back 5 to 7 years in favour of the Moon, a decision that sounds like a retreat. And, as we'll see much later tonight, might actually be the most rational move anyone has made. All of which points to the idea I want to plant now, because it is the spine of everything that follows. Traveling between the planets is not waiting on one miracle. There is no single missing breakthrough, no one invention that unlocks the solar system the way the transistor unlocked computing. What stands between us and the planets is a chain of separate, identifiable, individually solvable problems. One link is propulsion. We have to throw mass out the back of our ships much faster than chemistry allows. One link is biology. We have to keep soft, gravity-grown human bodies alive through journeys measured in years. And one link is infrastructure. We have to stop hauling every drop of fuel and every gram of supplies up from the bottom of Earth's gravity well, because the mathematics of that approach is merciless. Forge all three links, and the planet's open. And the remarkable thing about 2026, the reason this is the right year to ask the question, is that every one of those links is visibly being forged, right now, in real time. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to walk that chain link by link. Along the way, you'll meet an engine the size of a small car that ran at 4,000 megawatts in the open Nevada desert in 1968 and was then buried by a budget meeting. You'll meet a spaceship designed in dead seriousness to reach Saturn by 1970, propelled by atomic bombs. You'll meet a price tag of $62.5 trillion for a single gram of fuel and a physics-breaking thruster that fooled NASA's own laboratory before a German university found the ghost in the machine. And by the end, we'll assemble the honest checklist: what exists, what's in testing, what's missing, and how long the rest might really take. But all of it starts in a small wooden house in provincial Russia, more than 120 years ago, where a deaf schoolteacher wrote down a single equation. That equation has ruled every rocket ever launched. It is the reason Mars takes 9 months. It is the tyrant we have to understand before we can plot against it. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number part 2, the equation that rules everything. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was not supposed to matter. He was a self-taught schoolteacher in Kaluga, a provincial town southwest of Moscow, left mostly deaf by childhood scarlet fever, working in near total isolation from the scientific establishment of his day. And in 1903, the same year, the Wright brothers managed 12 seconds of powered flight at Kitty Hawk. He published a paper containing what we now call the rocket equation. Powered airplanes barely existed, and this man had already written down the mathematical law that would govern travel to other worlds. The equation itself is short enough to fit on a postage stamp, and its meaning can be said in one sentence. The speed a rocket can reach depends on how fast it throws its exhaust out the back, multiplied by the logarithm of how much of the rocket is fuel versus everything else. That word logarithm sounds harmless. It is not harmless. It is the single most punishing word in all of spaceflight, and here's why. A logarithm grows slowly, painfully slowly, which means that if you want your final speed to grow, the fuel fraction has to grow exponentially. Suppose your engine's exhaust velocity gives you a certain speed with a rocket that's half fuel. To go meaningfully faster, you don't add a little more fuel, you double, then quadruple, the fuel for each equal step in speed. Every kilometer per second you add to your wish list multiplies, rather than adds to, the fuel bill. And the fuel itself has mass, which needs more fuel to push it, which needs more fuel to push that. The equation folds back on itself like a snake eating its own tail, and the result is that chemical rockets are, by mass, barely rockets at all. They are flying fuel tanks with a payload stapled to the top. The Saturn V is the perfect specimen. The machine that took humans to the moon stood 110 meters tall and weighed about 2,900 tons. Fully fueled, and roughly 85% of that mass was propellant. Of every 100 kilograms sitting on the launch pad on the morning of a moon mission, about 85 kilograms were fuel and oxidizer. Around 12 were tanks, engines, and structure that got thrown away in pieces along the route, and approximately 3 kilograms, 3, actually made it to the vicinity of the moon. The most powerful machine human beings had ever constructed was, by mass, 97% overhead. Engineers of the era squeezed one more trick out of the mathematics, and it tells you how desperate the situation is. They threw the rocket away as it flew. Staging, stacking 2 or 3 rockets on top of one another, and discarding each as it empties, exists for exactly one reason. Dead weight is poison inside an exponential equation. The Saturn V shed its colossal first stage minutes into flight, dropped its second stage minutes after that, and arrived in orbit as a small fraction of the machine that left the pad. Imagine climbing a ladder and soaring off each rung beneath you as you go, because carrying the rungs makes the climb impossible. That is not a metaphor for inefficiency. It is the actual, optimal engineering solution under chemical propulsion. When throwing away 90% of your vehicle mid-journey is the smart move, the problem is not your engineering. The problem is your equation. Engineers handle this tyranny with a currency, and it's worth learning because it's the actual money of the solar system. The currency is called delta V, change in velocity, and every journey has a price expressed in it. Climbing from Earth's surface into low Earth orbit costs about 9.4 kilometers per second of delta V, most of it spent fighting gravity and punching through the atmosphere. That single climb, those first few hundred kilometers, is the most expensive leg of any journey in the inner solar system. Once you're in orbit, the prices drop wonderfully. Leaving orbit for a Mars transfer costs around 3.6 kilometers per second more. The science fiction writer Robert Heinlein put it in a line engineers still, quote, "Once you're in low Earth orbit, you're halfway to anywhere." He wasn't being poetic energetically, it's close to literal truth. Earth's gravity well is the mountain, and orbit is the summit ridge. Everything beyond is gentler slopes. The full delta V map of the solar system reads like a tariff schedule, and once you can read it, every mission you've ever heard of makes sudden sense. From low Earth orbit, reaching the moon's surface costs about 5.9 kilometers per second more. A Mars transfer runs around 3.6. Venus comes slightly cheaper than that, which is part of why Venus, not Mars, was the first planet our probes ever reached. The outer planets get expensive fast, not because orbiting them is harder, but because the sun's gravity fights you for every meter of the climb outward. A direct route to Jupiter costs more delta V than the entire ascent off Earth that consumed 85% of a Saturn V. And nearly every one of those prices must be paid again in reverse. If you intend to stop when you arrive, slowing down costs what speeding up does, a symmetry the universe enforces without sympathy. The map is fixed. The only question, which the rest of tonight tries to answer, is what currency will pay it in. So why, if Mars is energetically so reachable from orbit, does the trip take the better part of a year? Because of the ceiling, the hard ceiling on how fast chemistry can throw exhaust, a chemical rocket is a controlled fire, and the energy it can release is fixed by the chemical bonds in its propellants. Burn hydrogen with oxygen, the most energetic practical pairing we have, and you can hurl the exhaust out at about 4.4 kilometers per second, an efficiency engineers express as roughly 450 seconds of specific impulse. That number was effectively reached in the 1960s with engines like the RL-10, and it has not meaningfully moved since, because it cannot move. It's not an engineering limit, it's the energy content of molecular bonds. The Raptor engines on today's Starship burn methane instead of hydrogen, deliberately accepting a somewhat lower exhaust velocity, around 380 seconds, in exchange for a fuel that's denser, easier to store, and this will matter enormously later tonight, manufacturable on Mars. Hold those two numbers side by side, and the whole shape of our predicament appears. The exhaust leaves the nozzle at about 4 kilometers per second. A fast trip to Mars wants cruise speeds several times that. The logarithm makes the price of that gap astronomical almost literally. So instead of burning hard and flying fast, we do the only affordable thing. We give our ships a single shove and let them coast, unpowered, along the minimum energy path for 8 or 9 months, like a message in a bottle thrown into a current. Every Mars probe you've ever heard of traveled this way. Not because we're patient, but because we're broke, energetically broke, every single time, by order of an equation written before the aeroplane was practical. Tsiolkovsky himself never saw any of it. He died in 1935, 22 years before Sputnik, having spent his life teaching provincial school children and publishing, often at his own expense, papers on space stations, airlocks, and multi-stage rockets that almost nobody read. He worked out staging before anyone needed it. He proposed liquid hydrogen and oxygen as propellants decades before any engine burned them. And he left behind a sentence that has outlived every rocket since, the unofficial motto of everything this video is about. Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot remain in the cradle forever. The man who discovered the prison's walls was also the first to insist in writing that the door existed. Now, if you can't break a law, you look for loopholes, and the rocket equation has exactly 3. Loophole 1. Raise the exhaust velocity, leave chemistry behind entirely, and throw mass with nuclear heat, electric fields, or fusion fire. That's where we're headed in Act 2. Loophole 2. Refuel along the way if you can refill your tanks in orbit, at the Moon or on Mars. The equation resets at every stop, and a journey of impossible legs becomes a journey of easy ones. That revolution is scheduled for testing this very year, and it's Act 4. And loophole 3, the subtlest one, is to stop fighting the universe and let it carry you. Because the solar system, it turns out, is not an empty room you power through. It has terrain, it has currents and passes and toll booths. It has, in a very real sense, highways. And one of those highways only lines up once every 175 years. The last time it did, we threw 2 small spacecraft onto it, and they are now the farthest human-made objects in existence. That story, the secret geography of the solar system, is where we go next. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number. Part 3. The Hidden Highways. There is a map of the solar system that you have never seen on a classroom wall. The familiar map shows 8 Pluto planets strung along neat circles around the Sun, and it teaches you to think of travel as drawing a straight line from one circle to another. That map is a lie. Nothing in space travels in straight lines, and nothing sits still waiting for you to arrive. Every world is a moving target, sliding along a curved racetrack, and your spacecraft is not a car you steer, it's a stone you throw. Once the engine cuts off, your path is fixed by gravity alone. Interplanetary navigation is not driving. It is the art of throwing a stone from a moving platform so that it lands, months later, in the catcher's mitt of a world that was nowhere near the target when you let go. The fundamental move in this art has a name, the Hohmann transfer, worked out by a German engineer named Walter Hohmann in 1925, decades before anyone could attempt it. Picture a runner sprinting around a track, and you standing in the infield with a ball. If you throw the ball at where the runner is, you'll miss by a mile. You throw it at where the runner will be. A Hohmann transfer is exactly that throw, scaled to worlds. A long, lazy ellipse that leaves Earth's orbit on one side of the Sun and kisses the orbit of Mars on the other side, timed so that Mars itself arrives at the meeting point in the same moment your spacecraft does. It is the cheapest possible route the minimum energy path, and for chemical rockets, cheapest is the only option on the menu. The price of that cheapness is time, about 8 to 9 months of silent coasting, one way, but the timing requirement creates something stranger, a calendar that rules everything. Earth and Mars only fall into the correct alignment for this throw once every 26 months. Engineers call it the synodic period. Mission planners call it the launch window, and it is merciless. Miss your window by a few weeks, a failed part, a budget delay, a hurricane over the launch site, and you don't wait a few weeks. You wait more than 2 years for the planets to come back around. Entire missions, entire careers have lived and died by that 26-month metronome. It is why Mars missions seem to launch in strange clusters, 3 or 4 probes, departing within weeks of each other, then years of nothing. Everyone is catching the same train. The summer of 2003 showed what the calendar can do when it turns generous. That August, Mars swung closer to Earth than it had in nearly 60,000 years, closer than at any moment since Neanderthals watched the same red dot cross the sky. Humanity responded the way you'd hope. Practically everything that could fly flew. NASA dispatched the twin rovers Spirit and Opportunity weeks apart. Europe sent Mars Express. Japan's Nozomi probe was already limping toward the same rendezvous. Newspapers ran viewing guides, telescopes sold out, and for one season the whole planet looked up at the same time. Then the window closed, the planets drifted apart, and the Armada was followed by the usual years of silence until the clock came back around. We speak of exploring Mars as a continuous activity, but it has always been a pulse, one beat every 26 months, set not by ambition or funding, but by geometry older than the species. For human crews, this calendar hardens into something genuinely sobering. Mission designers speak of 2 basic shapes for a round trip. The Conjunction-class mission rides the cheap path out, then waits on Mars for about 500 days until the planets align for the cheap path home, making the whole journey roughly 3 years, door to door. The Opposition-class mission shortens the stay to weeks, but pays for it with a longer, harder flight home, often swinging inward past Venus, closer to the Sun, taking more radiation and more risk to spend less time at the destination. Cheap and long, or brutal and slightly shorter. Those are today's tickets, and there is no third option printed yet. When engineers actually choose a departure day, they consult one of the most charming artifacts in all of spaceflight, a chart called a pork chop plot. Plot every possible departure date against every possible arrival date. Color in the energy cost of each combination, and the cheap solutions pool into closed contours that look, engineers swear by this, like a pork chop on a butcher's diagram. Somewhere in the tender center of that chop is your launch day, the shape of dinner deciding the fate of billion-dollar machines. There are also tricks, beautiful ones, for stretching the fuel you have. The first is the Oberth effect, and it sounds like cheating. A rocket burn performed while you're screaming through the low point of your orbit, moving at maximum speed close to a planet, buys you far more final energy than the identical burn performed out in calm, distant space. The mathematics is real, and the consequence is wonderfully counterintuitive. The best place to fire your engine is at the bottom of a dive, deliberately falling toward a world precisely so that your fuel buys more when you spend it there. Speed makes fuel more valuable, so you go fast where it's free. This single effect quietly shapes real missions in ways passengers would never guess. Probes bound for orbit around the giant planets save their braking fuel for one screaming pass just over the cloud tops, firing at the moment of maximum speed, because that is where each kilogram of propellant buys the most change. Mission designers will bend an entire multi-year trajectory, adding loops around the inner solar system, adding months of travel purely to arrange one good close approach burn at the far end. It feels like getting something for nothing, and in a sense it is. The extra energy comes from the geometry of falling. The universe, it turns out, runs a discount window. It's just located at the bottom of every gravity well, and it's only open for a few minutes per pass. The second trick built the modern outer solar system. A gravity assist lets a spacecraft swing close behind a moving planet and steal a sliver of its orbital momentum. The planet slows by an amount too small to ever measure, and the spacecraft is hurled onward faster, its trajectory bent like a slingshot stone. In the late 1970s, the four giant planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, drifted into a configuration that permitted one spacecraft to hop from world to world, assist after assist, collecting speed at every encounter. That alignment occurs roughly once every 175 years. We noticed it just in time, and we threw Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 onto it. Both are now in interstellar space, the farthest objects humanity has ever sent anywhere, still whispering home on 20 watts. The Cassini mission to Saturn played the same game in miniature, looping past Venus twice, then Earth, then Jupiter, adding years and billions of kilometers to its route, because the roundabout path was the only one its fuel could afford. Read that again? We made the trip longer to make it possible. That is what the rocket equation does to travel plans. Follow this logic to its end, and you find the strangest road system of all, mapped in the 1990s using mathematics descended from the three-body problem, the interplanetary transport network. Threading between the Lagrange points, the balance points where gravities cancel, runs a web of pathways, along which a spacecraft can drift between regions of the solar system for almost no fuel at all. Nearly free travel. Real missions, like NASA's Genesis and Japan's Haiten, have actually ridden these corridors. There is just one catch, and by now you can guess its flavor. The free roads are slow. Transit times stretch into years and decades. The universe will carry you for nothing, but it will not hurry, and a human crew breathing, eating, and absorbing radiation cannot afford a free ride that takes a decade. So here is where the first act leaves us. The geography of the solar system offers discounts, windows, slingshots, free corridors, but no speed. Every clever route still obeys the chemical ceiling. Mechanics can trim the fare, but cannot shorten the year. If humans are ever going to cross between planets in weeks instead of seasons, the exhaust itself has to leave the nozzle faster, which means abandoning fire and finding something hotter. And the remarkable thing, the almost painful thing, is that we already did this. More than half a century ago, in the Nevada desert, the United States built and tested, at full power, in the open air, an engine that did not burn anything at all. It worked. It was ready. And then it vanished so completely that most people alive today have never heard its name, is less than break time, equals 1s, is greater than number. Part 4. The engine we built and buried. Drive about an hour and a half northwest of Las Vegas, and you reach a stretch of the old Nevada test site called Jackass Flats. Today, it's silence and creosote bushes. But in the 1960s, this was the loudest place in the American West, because this is where the United States tested nuclear rocket engines, not on paper, not in simulations, but bolted to stands, running at full power in the open desert air. The program was called Project Rover, and later NERVA, the Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Application, and over roughly 15 years, it built and ran 23 nuclear rocket reactors. This is, I'd argue, the single most important forgotten story in spaceflight, because it answers tonight's question more directly than anything happening today. We didn't merely imagine a better engine. We built one. It worked. The idea is almost embarrassingly simple. A chemical rocket gets its energy from burning fuel, and we've seen where that ceiling sits. A nuclear thermal rocket separates the energy from the propellant entirely. You run liquid hydrogen through the core of an operating nuclear reactor, heating it to around 2,500 Kelvin hotter than the surface temperature of some small stars, and let it blast out a nozzle. Nothing burns. There's no combustion at all, no oxidizer, no flame. The hydrogen never reacts with anything. It's simply heated until it leaves the nozzle at enormous speed. The reactor is the fire, and hydrogen, the lightest atom there is, and therefore the fastest moving at any given temperature, is the perfect thing to throw. The way they tested these machines tells you everything about the era. The early reactors in the series were called Key, WI, named with dry engineer humour for the flightless bird, because these versions were never meant to leave the ground. They were bolted upright to test stands, fueled and run at full power, with their exhaust roaring straight up into the open desert sky, a plume of hydrogen that had just passed through an operating reactor core, vented to the Nevada wind, while instruments drank data and engineers watched from bunkers a couple of kilometers away. Nothing remotely like it would be permitted today, and the modern revival spent years engineering its way around that fact with closed-loop capture systems. But the brute confidence of the old way produced something we have never had since, an enormous, fast, full-power experimental record. 23 reactors worth of trial, error, and fix, accumulated at a pace modern programs can only envy. The numbers land like a revelation. Where the best chemical engines reach roughly 450 seconds of specific impulse, Nerva-class engines demonstrated about 850 seconds, with designs reaching toward 900, double. And remember the cruel logarithm from Part 2 inside an exponential equation. Doubling the exhaust velocity doesn't double your capability, it transforms it. Double the exhaust speed, and a Mars ship can carry half the propellant for the same trip, or fly the same propellant load on a far faster, harder trajectory. Mission studies from the era put nuclear thermal Mars transits at 4 to 5 months instead of 8 or 9, cutting the crew's time in the void nearly in half. Every problem we'll meet in Act 3, the radiation dose, the bone loss, the psychological erosion, every one of them scales with trip time. The engine is the medicine, and the hardware was astonishingly real. The test reactors at Jackass Flats were not laboratory curiosities. The largest, called Phoebus 2A, ran in June of 1968 at about 4,000 megawatts of thermal power. 4,000 megawatts, the combined output of roughly 4 large commercial nuclear power stations, produced in a device about the size of a small car, running in the open desert, with engineers watching from bunkers a couple of kilometers away. For a few minutes that summer, that compact machine was among the most powerful reactors that had ever operated anywhere on Earth. The following year, an engine called XE Prime was tested firing downward in flight configuration, with all its systems arranged exactly as they would be in space. It started, throttled, and stopped on command 28 times. By 1969, the same year as the moon landing, the United States possessed a nuclear rocket engine that was, functionally speaking, ready to begin qualification for a human Mars program. NASA had sketched that program, Mars expeditions in the early 1980s, riding Nerva stages. None of it came easily, which is precisely what makes the record so valuable. Early test reactors cracked their fuel elements as 2,500-degree hydrogen tore through them. Hot hydrogen, it turns out, is one of the most corrosive substances imaginable, embrittling and gnawing at almost any material it touches. The engineers iterated new coatings, new fuel geometries, new flow paths, reactor after reactor, failure after fix, until the late machines ran for an hour at full power and restarted dozens of times on command. That is what technological readiness actually looks like, not a clever design on paper, but a graveyard of solved problems. By the program's end, the remaining work was qualification and integration engineering's paperwork, not invention. The machine worked. You know what happened instead. Apollo achieved its political purpose the moment Armstrong's boot touched regolith, and the appetite for the next mountain evaporated with stunning speed. The Mars plans were shelved, and an engine without a mission is just a line item. In 1973, Nerva was cancelled outright. The reactors went cold, the test stands rusted, and the most consequential propulsion advance of the 20th century was packed into archives. Here's the detail I find genuinely haunting. Nerva did not fail. No physical showstopper was ever found. The engine died of politics years before physics would ever have had a vote. For 50 years, that's where the story froze. Then, remarkably, it thawed. In 2023, DARPA and NASA announced a joint program called DRACO, the demonstration rocket for agile cislunar operations, with Lockheed Martin building the vehicle, and a company called BWXT building a reactor fueled with high-assay, low-enriched uranium, a fuel form chosen so the engine could be tested and flown under modern safety rules. The target was a specific impulse, around 787 seconds, and this was the headline, an actual flight demonstration in orbit planned for around 2027. After half a century, the buried engine was being dug up. Space agencies talked about it as the obvious workhorse for fast crewed Mars transits. It looked, for about 2 years, like the propulsion link of our chain was finally being forged in the open. And then, in the middle of 2025, DRACO was cancelled too. Quietly, a line in a budget document, confirmed in June when DARPA wound down the program. No explosion, no scandal, no technical failure, but the stated reason is, I promise you, the most interesting sentence in this entire act. DARPA explained that DRACO had been conceived before what it called a precipitous decrease in launch costs, and that once getting mass to orbit became cheap, the expensive elegance of a nuclear engine no longer looked like a clear win over the brute force alternative. Just launch more propellant and refuel. NASA's own budget language said the same thing in bureaucratic prose. There are nearer-term propulsion alternatives for Mars transit. Translation: rockets got cheap faster than reactors got ready. Sit with that, because it quietly reorganizes the entire question we're asking tonight. For decades, the assumption was that the chain's first link propulsion had to be forged as a better engine. What the DRACO cancellation reveals is that the people writing the checks now believe the first link is being forged a different way entirely, not by raising the exhaust velocity, but by making mass in orbit so cheap that the old equation's tyranny gets diluted under sheer tonnage. Whether that bet is brilliant or short-sighted is a genuinely open controversy. Critics point out that no amount of cheap propellant shortens a chemical transit below its energetic floor. The crew still rides for most of a year, soaking up everything the void serves. Defenders answer that a real, flying, refuelable heavy rocket beats a paper reactor every single time. Both camps are right about something. As of mid-2026, the blunt fact is this: the United States and everyone else has no funded nuclear thermal flight program. The fast crew engine slot, the one Nerva was built to fill in 1969, stands vacant once again. But nuclear thermal was never the only road past chemistry, it was only the most muscular one. While Nerva was being buried and reborn and buried again, a completely different family of engines was quietly leaving the laboratory and going to work engines built on the opposite philosophy in every respect. Instead of maximum power for minutes, they produce almost no power for years. Their thrust is so feeble you could stop one with your breath. You could rest your hand against a firing one and feel barely more than a whisper of pressure. And one of them holds the all-time record more accumulated velocity change than any spacecraft engine in history. Patience, it turns out, is also a propulsion technology. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number, part 5, the whisper engines. Every engine we've discussed so far is a shout minutes of fury, then silence. An ion engine is something else entirely. It is a sentence spoken so quietly you'd swear nothing was said, continued without pause for years, until it has said more than any shout ever could. And the inversion at its core is the cleverest trick in working propulsion today. Where the rocket equation rewards exhaust velocity, the ion engine simply refuses to throw mass at chemical speeds. It takes a noble gas xenon, usually strips electrons from its atoms to make charged ions, and accelerates those ions through an electric field to exhaust velocities of 30, 40, 50 kilometers per second. That's roughly 10 times the very best chemical exhaust, corresponding to specific impulses from 1,500 to 3,000 seconds and beyond. By the only metric the tyrant equation respects, these are the most efficient engines humanity has ever flown. The price is thrust, or rather, the almost comical absence of it. A flight-proven ion engine pushes with a force measured in millinewtons. The standard comparison, and it's accurate, is the weight of a single sheet of paper resting on your open palm. That is the full might of the engine. An ion-driven spacecraft cannot launch itself off a planet. It cannot even hurry. Light the engine, and your acceleration is so small that for the first day you've barely changed speed at all. But the engine doesn't stop. It runs through the day, the week, the month, sipping xenon by the gram, while a chemical engine would gulp tons, and the arithmetic of persistence slowly becomes unanswerable. Days become weeks, the velocity keeps climbing, and after a year of continuous thrust, that sheet of paper has pushed your spacecraft to speeds no chemical stage could have reached with any fuel load you could launch. The machinery behind the Whisper deserves a moment, because it is elegant. The propellant of choice is xenon, a heavy noble gas that ionizes easily, stores compactly, and reacts with nothing. In a gridded ion engine, like Dawn's, electrically charged grids accelerate the ions in an orderly beam the highest efficiencies, with thrust modest even by ion standards. In a Hall effect thruster, like the ones flying on Psyche and on hundreds of commercial satellites, a magnetic field traps a swirling ring of electrons that ionizes and accelerates the gas in one continuous stream, somewhat less efficient, considerably more thrust, mechanically simpler. Both produce the same signature, a steady, ghost blue glow, utterly silent, the visual opposite of a chemical launch. If a chemical rocket is a bonfire, an ion engine is a pilot light that intends to cross the solar system. The proof is a spacecraft called Dawn, and its resume still reads like a misprint. Launched in 2007, Dawn flew to the asteroid belt, entered orbit around the giant asteroid Vesta, surveyed it for a year, and then did something no spacecraft had ever done. It left orbit and travelled to a second world, the dwarf planet Ceres, and went into orbit there too. 2 destinations, orbited in sequence on one tank. Over its mission, Dawn's ion engines accumulated more than 11 kilometers per second of delta V, the greatest velocity change any spacecraft has ever produced, with its own propulsion, exceeding what entire chemical rocket stages deliver. Achieved with the force of a sheet of paper. And this is no museum technology. Right now, as you're listening to this, NASA's Psyche spacecraft is coasting through the void, with its Hall effect thrusters, glowing faint blue, bound for a metal asteroid. It will reach in 2029, having launched in October of 2023. Hundreds of commercial satellites orbiting over your head tonight maneuver on the same principle. The Whisper engine is not the future. It is the routine present. The passport stamps have been accumulating for 2 decades, quietly. Japan's Hayabusa rode ion engines to an asteroid, and for the first time in history brought a piece of one home. Its successor, Hayabusa 2, repeated the feat at a second asteroid and dropped its sample capsule into the Australian outback in 2020. Europe's Smart 1 spiralled out to the moon on a single Hall thruster, sipping less power than a household kettle. Bepi Colombo is riding ion propulsion toward Mercury right now, fighting the sun's gravity downhill, a journey that is energetically harder than reaching Jupiter and effectively impossible to fly efficiently any other way. No crew has ever ridden behind these engines, and given the gentle accelerations, no impatient crew ever will. But as freight haulers, surveyors, and pathfinders, the Whisper engines have already colonized the job. So why aren't astronauts riding ion drives to Mars' next window? 2 reasons, and the first is simply that humans are impatient cargo. A crew needs to arrive before their bodies and supplies give out, and accelerations, this gentle spiral slowly outward for months before reaching interplanetary crews. The second reason is sneakier: electricity. An ion engine doesn't make power, it spends it. Every ion hurled out the back was accelerated at the cost of electrical energy, and that energy must come from somewhere. Near Earth, solar panels answer nicely. But sunlight thins with the square of distance by Jupiter's orbit. You're collecting around 4% of the light you had at Earth, and the panels required start growing to absurd, football field scales. The Whisper engine has the efficiency to cross the solar system. What it lacks, out in the dim distances, is something to eat. Which leads to an obvious thought: bolt a nuclear reactor to an ion drive and let it eat that. The concept is called nuclear electric propulsion, and on paper it's magnificent. Specific impulses approaching 10,000 seconds, continuous thrust for years, total indifference to sunlight. Mission studies adore it. But it carries an unglamorous burden that has sunk every attempt so far: heat. A reactor making megawatts of electricity also makes megawatts of waste heat, and in vacuum, there's no air or water to dump it into. Your only option is to radiate it away, which means hauling enormous radiator panels, and suddenly your elegant starship is mostly wing-shaped plumbing, fighting the very mass equation it was meant to escape. The encouraging footnote came in 2018 when NASA's Kilopower project ran a small experimental space reactor called Krusty through full-power tests, proof that compact fission power for spacecraft is real at the scale of kilowatts. The gap between kilowatts and megawatts is where nuclear electric propulsion currently lives, waiting. And then there's the engine, with no engine at all. A solar sail spends nothing: no propellant, no reactor, no tank, and simply lets sunlight push it. Light carries momentum. It's feeble beyond belief, but like the ion drive's Whisper, it never stops. Japan's Ikaros proved it in 2010, riding a 14-meter sail past Venus, the first true solar sail voyage in history. The Planetary Society's Light Sail 2 raised its own orbit in 2019 on photon pressure alone, on a budget raised from ordinary citizens. For tiny probes and patient cargo, sails may one day move freight between worlds for literally nothing. For people for warm bodies with heartbeats and deadlines, they are, and will likely remain, far too slow. Notice the shape that's emerged across these last 2 parts, because it mirrors something old. Slow, efficient, tireless movers for freight. Fast, hot, hungry movers for people. That's exactly how humanity conquered Earth's oceans bulk cargo, crawling on container ships, passengers streaking overhead at altitude. A genuine interplanetary civilization will almost certainly run the same 2-tier system. Ion tugs and sails, drifting ore and supplies along the cheap, slow roads, while crews ride something much fiercer. And the Whisper engines are, here, flying, proven. It's the fierce tier, the fast crew engine, Nerva's vacant chair that remains unfilled. There is one technology that wants that chair more than any other. It does not burn its fuel like a chemical rocket, and it does not split atoms like Nerva. It does the thing the sun does, presses light nuclei together until they fuse and release energy on a scale that makes fission look frugal. For 70 years, it has been the punchline of energy research, perpetually 30 years away. But in March of 2026, in an industrial building in Bletchley, England, the same town where Alan Turing's codebreakers once worked, a company you've probably never heard of, switched on a machine, and inside it, for the first time, a rocket exhaust system designed for fusion lit up with living plasma. The decades of someday just produced a date is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number part 6 burning stars in a bottle. The event was live streamed, of all places, at a conference hosted by Jeff Bezos. In late March of 2026, a British company called Pulsar Fusion powered up the Mark I version of its Sunbird system at its facility in Bletchley and achieved what plasma physicists call first plasma, the moment a machine first creates and holds the Bletchley, electrically charged, ultra-hot state of matter in which fusion can eventually occur. The test used krypton gas, shaped and confined by electric and magnetic fields, glowing inside an exhaust architecture designed not for a power station, but for a rocket. Let me be precise, because precision is the difference between science and hype. No fusion occurred. First plasma is to a fusion rocket what a first heartbeat is to a marathon necessary, meaningful, and a very long way from the finish line. But it happened in hardware, in public, on camera, in a device whose stated purpose is to push spacecraft between planets. What Pulsar is actually trying to build is worth understanding, because it's not a fusion rocket bolted to your spaceship. The Sunbird is designed as an orbital tugboat, a vehicle that lives in space, docks with conventional spacecraft in low Earth orbit, and hauls them onto fast interplanetary trajectories before letting go. The company's projections, and these are projections, a company's own targets, not demonstrated performance, describe a mature Sunbird delivering 1 to 2 tons of payload to Mars orbit in under 6 months, against roughly 10 months for an equivalent chemical mission. Their published roadmap puts plasma diagnostics through mid-2026, an in-orbit demonstration of the core technology around 2027, and production vehicles in the early 2030s. Treat every one of those dates with the skepticism startup timelines have earned. But notice what exists regardless of the schedule: a funded company, real hardware, hot plasma, and a declared intention to occupy exactly the vacant chair we identified the fast tier of the interplanetary fleet. They are not alone either. A California company called Helicity Space, backed in part by NASA's Advanced Concepts program, is developing what it calls the Helicity Drive, built on magnetic reconnection. The same violent process that powers solar flares, the sun literally snapping its own magnetic field lines and flinging plasma outward. Helicity's near-term milestone, slated for 2026, is demonstrating its plasma jets reconnecting and amplifying deliberately well short of net fusion gain, but walking the same road. And in the academic world, Princeton researchers have spent years refining a concept called the direct fusion drive, a compact reactor fusing deuterium with helium-3 that would produce around 10,000 seconds of specific impulse and electrical power for the spacecraft from the same device. One published mission study puts a direct fusion drive orbiter at Pluto in orbit, not flying past in about 4 years. New Horizons needed 9.5 just to wave as it flew by. Here's a subtlety that makes space fusion more plausible than it might sound. The job is easier than the one fusion has famously failed at for 70 years. A fusion power station must produce more electricity than it consumes, run around the clock for decades, and sell power cheaper than coal. It must beat the grid. A fusion rocket has no grid to beat. It only needs to make plasma ferociously hot, point it in one direction, and let it leave, and an inefficiency that would bankrupt a power plant simply becomes a slightly warmer exhaust. Space even donates the vacuum, which Earth-bound reactors spend fortunes creating and maintaining. Some designs use fuels like deuterium and helium-3 that release most of their energy as charged particles steerable with magnetic fields rather than absorbed as neutron damage, and helium-3, scarce on Earth, is sprinkled through the lunar soil by the solar wind, a fact that has launched 1,000 speculative mining proposals. Treat that last part as exactly the speculation it is. The core point stands on its own. The rocket version of fusion is the forgiving version, and the forgiving version is the one glowing in Bletchley. Why does fusion keep pulling every serious roadmap toward it like this? Because of what it does to the tyrant. Kilogram for kilogram, fusion fuel releases millions of times more energy than chemical bonds. It is the most concentrated, practical energy source physics offers below outright annihilation. Run that through Tsiolkovsky's logarithm, and the entire grammar of spaceflight changes. Launch windows soften from ironclad law into mild preference, because with enough exhaust velocity, you can afford inefficient trajectories any month you like. The 500-day forced stay on Mars becomes a choice rather than a sentence. The outer planets move from once-per-generation flyby targets to destinations with return tickets. Every misery in tonight's story, the windows, the years of coasting, the radiation meter ticking in Act 3, every one of them is downstream of weak exhaust, and fusion is the strongest exhaust the periodic table is willing to sell us. Here's the part of the story that should genuinely unsettle you, though. We have known a route to this class of performance since before the Beatles broke up and we banned it. In 1958, some of the most brilliant physicists of the atomic age, among them Freeman Dyson and the bomb designer Ted Taylor, began work at General Atomics on Project Orion, a spacecraft propelled by throwing actual nuclear bombs out the back, one after another, and riding the detonations against a massive pusher plate mounted on shock absorbers. I know exactly how that sounds. It sounds like a cartoon. It was not a cartoon, it was a funded program, and the physics closed. Calculated specific impulses ran from 10,000 to 100,000 seconds. Performance fusion startups still only dream about. The team's unofficial slogan was Mars by 1965, Saturn by 1970, and Dyson, no fantasist, believed the engineering supported it. They even flew a meter-wide model called Hot Rod on conventional explosives, pulse after pulse, stable, climbing. The scale of what they were designing still stuns. Orion ships on the drawing boards ran to thousands of tons, not capsules but buildings, with crews of dozens, machine shops, real beds, years of supplies, because with bomb propulsion, mass almost stopped mattering, and the engineers, giddy with that freedom, sketched interiors more like a naval vessel than a spacecraft. Dyson himself carried the project's shadow for the rest of his long life. He calculated the worldwide fallout cost of each ground launch in statistical human lives, found the number unbearable, and concluded such a ship should only ever be lit far from Earth. The version that haunted him was never the weapon, it was the voyage that never happened. What killed Orion wasn't a flaw in the concept. It was the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, which outlawed nuclear detonations in space and made the ship illegal before it could be attempted. For the record, that treaty was almost certainly wise. But mark the pattern, because it's now appeared 3 times in one evening. Nerva died of budgets, Draco died of spreadsheets, Orion died of diplomacy. In nearly 70 years of trying to escape chemical propulsion, physics has never once been the thing that said no. We have always said no to ourselves. So the propulsion link of our chain stands like this in 2026. The known physics is generous. The working engines are slow, the fast engines are unfunded or unfinished, and the first fusion exhaust plasma is glowing in a shed in Bletchley. The link is visibly on the anvil. But before we leave the engine room and meet the fragile passengers in Act 3, we owe ourselves one detour, a walk past the other shelf. The shelf of shortcuts. Because alongside the legitimate hard roads, there have always been seductive easy ones. Drives that claim to need no propellant at all, fuels with price tags you won't believe, and a warp bubble with valid mathematics and impossible groceries. One of those shortcuts produced measurable thrust in a NASA laboratory and made headlines about broken physics around the world. It took 5 years and a basement in Dresden to find out what was actually pushing. Is less than break time equals 1s? Is greater than number, part 7. The forbidden shelf. Every age of stuck technology breeds the same dream. The loophole, the workaround, the trick the establishment missed. Alchemists dreamed it about gold. Perpetual motion cranks dreamed it about energy. The rocket equation is such a perfect tyrant that spaceflight's version of the dream was inevitable, and it has a name that lit up the internet for a decade, the M drive. Proposed by a British engineer named Roger Scheuer in the early 2000s, it was a sealed, asymmetric copper cavity into which you pump microwaves. Nothing comes out, no exhaust, no propellant, nothing. And yet, the claim went, it pushes. A reactionless thruster. If real, it would not merely beat Tsiolkovsky's equation, it would repeal it, along with conservation of momentum, a principle physics has checked at every scale from electrons to colliding galaxies and never once caught slipping. The story should have ended at that paragraph, and it didn't. In 2016, a NASA laboratory Eagleworks at the Johnson Space Center, the agency's own small outpost for testing fringe propulsion claims, put an M drive on a torsion pendulum in vacuum and published a peer-reviewed paper reporting thrust roughly 1.2 millinewtons per kilowatt. Tiny, there's our sheet of paper again, but if genuine, civilization-altering, because a thruster that needs no propellant breaks the exponential curse forever. Fuelless probes to the stars, hovering cars, the lot. The headlines wrote themselves, NASA confirms the impossible drive. I want to be fair to everyone in this story. Measuring micronewtons is savagely difficult, and publishing an anomaly so others can attack it is exactly how science is supposed to operate. The attack came from Dresden. A team at the Dresden University of Technology, led by physicist Martin Tajma, spent years building what may be the most carefully isolated thrust balance on Earth, specifically to hunt ghosts like this one. They replicated the Eagleworks setup, ran it, and saw the thrust. Same signal. Then they did the decisive thing. They rotated the device so that its claimed thrust pointed in a direction where it could not possibly register on the balance, and the signal stayed. The push was still there, even when the engine, by its own theory, couldn't be pushing the instrument at all. The signal had nothing to do with thrust. It was heat thermal expansion subtly warping the apparatus and the wiring as the cavity warmed, masquerading as micronewtons by shifting the balance arm. By 2021, the verdict was complete and quietly devastating. Every M-drive signal that had ever been reported was reproducible as a measurement artifact. Conservation of momentum never even took a hit. There is a real lesson in the wreckage, and it isn't that the dreamers were fools, it's that, at the micronewton scale, the universe is full of imposters, and the difference between a revolution and a warm wire is a basement in Dresden full of obsessive Germans. A cousin of the M drive, the Mach effect thruster, which at least attempts a theoretical mechanism within known physics, has received NASA Advanced Concepts funding and remains formally unresolved. But most independent replications find nothing once thermal and vibration ghosts are exercised. The pattern is consistent. The equation does not have a backdoor. It's fair to ask why serious institutions keep spending money testing claims like these, and the answer says something good about science rather than something embarrassing. The cost of checking is small. The payoff, if even one claim survived, would be the largest in the history of technology. And the act of building instruments sensitive enough to catch the imposters, the thermal drifts, the magnetic couplings, the vibration ghosts, advances measurement itself. The Dresden balance that killed the M drive now serves as one of the world's best tools for testing real microthrusters, the tiny ion engines that steer small satellites. Chasing the ghost left behind better ghost detectors. Science metabolizes even its dead ends, which is more than can be said for most human enterprises. So if you can't cheat the equation, what about simply paying it with the most expensive currency in existence? Antimatter is real. We make it at particle accelerators every day, and when a particle of matter meets its antiparticle, both vanish entirely into energy. Not a fraction released, like chemistry's billionths or fission's 1/10%. Everything. E equals mc squared, cashed out at face value. A few grams of antihydrogen annihilating with a few grams of hydrogen would release the energy of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima several times over. Tens of milligrams could plausibly push a probe to Mars in weeks. The physics is impeccable. The economics is a punchline. By NASA-cited estimates, producing antihydrogen with current accelerator methods costs on the order of $62.5 trillion per gram, and humanity's total all-time production amounts to nanograms, billionths of a gram, manufactured atom by atom, stored for minutes at a time in magnetic traps, because antimatter touching any container wall is, definitionally, an explosion. Antimatter is not a fuel. It is a proof, a marker of how high the energy ladder physically extends, far above the fusion rung we're currently struggling to reach. The shelf holds stranger items still, further back, gathering dust. The nuclear saltwater rocket proposed by the engineer Robert Zubrin would dissolve fissile material in water and let it go critical continuously as it flows out the nozzle. A rocket whose exhaust is, functionally, an ongoing nuclear detonation, with performance to match and a safety analysis nobody has ever volunteered to write. Positron concepts would annihilate anti-electrons instead of anti-protons, trading raw energy for tamer radiation. Every few years, a new arrival joins the collection, enjoys a flurry of papers, and settles into its place in the dust. None of this is wasted thought. These are the sketches a civilization makes of its own ceiling. But notice that nothing on the shelf, glamorous or cursed, is what's actually flying. What's flying is the boring ladder. The shelf is where we keep our impatience. And then there's the shelf's most glamorous occupant. In 1994, the physicist Miguel Alcubierre, inspired, he cheerfully admits, by Star Trek, published a solution to Einstein's equations of general relativity, describing a bubble of spacetime that contracts ahead of a ship and expands behind it, carrying the ship along faster than light could travel through the same region without the ship ever locally breaking the speed limit. The mathematics is valid. Spacetime really can stretch and squeeze. The universe's own expansion proves it daily. The catch sits in the ingredients list. The original bubble required negative energy density matter that weighs less than nothing in quantities comparable to the mass energy of Jupiter. Later refinements, including a flurry of physical warp drive papers around 2021, have trimmed those requirements by spectacular factors and even sketched versions using only positive energy at merely planetary scales. No laboratory anywhere has produced a teaspoon of any of it. The warp bubble belongs to theory's far horizon, not forbidden by what we know, just unbuildable by anyone we'll ever meet. Here's the thing. Though this detour was not a waste of our evening, and I'd argue it's one of the most clarifying stops on the whole route, ruling out shortcuts is progress. Every failed reactionless drive, every trillion-dollar gram, every Jupiter-sized grocery list is the universe telling us, with increasing firmness, where the real road is. And the real road is exactly the chain we've been forging all night. Chemical rockets made cheap and refuelable now. Nuclear heat next. fusion fire after that known physics. Hard engineering, no magic anywhere. The propulsion link, in other words, will be built rather than discovered. But a perfect engine, even a fusion torch, solves only one link of three, because the most delicate machinery on any interplanetary voyage was never in the engine bay. It's the 70 kilograms of salt water, calcium scaffolding, and electrical jelly strapped into the crew seat, a machine built by 4 billion years of evolution for exactly one environment, which the void between planets resembles in no respect whatsoever. From the first hour of the voyage, that machine begins, very quietly, to come apart. And the cruelest of its enemies is one no shield we can launch will fully stop a rain of iron falling from dead stars, arriving at almost the speed of light. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number, part 8, the storm you can't see. Everything we chose in the engine room follows the crew into this act, because here is the truth that mission designers live with and brochures never mention. Every propulsion decision is secretly a medical decision. The engine sets the trip time, and the trip time sets the dose, the radiation dose, the bone loss, the psychological wear. When we said the fast crew engine's chair was vacant, this is what's sitting in the waiting room. So as we examine what the void does to a human body, keep one hand on the thread we've been following all night. These problems are links in the same chain as the engines, and they're forged with the same two hammers, better ships or shorter trips. Space radiation comes in two species, and they could not be more different in character. The first is the solar particle event, the storm. Every so often, without much warning, the sun erupts and sprays the inner solar system with a torrent of fast protons. A bad storm arriving at an unshielded crew in interplanetary space could deliver radiation sickness or worse within hours. That sounds terrifying, and it is, but the storm is actually the manageable enemy. Protons are relatively easy to stop. A storm announces itself minutes to hours ahead as its first light-speed particles arrive, and it passes in hours or days. The solution is medieval, and it works. A shelter, a small, heavily protected room, often simply the corner of the ship where the water tanks, food, and supplies are stacked thickest where the crew waits out the weather. The Orion capsule that carried the Artemis II crew around the moon this April has exactly such a protocol. The crew rehearsed building a shelter out of stowage bags and the vehicle's own structure. Storms are survivable the way hurricanes are survivable, with warning, walls, and respect. We have already rolled these dice once, and it's worth remembering how the roll came out. In August of 1972, in the quiet months between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions, the Sun unleashed one of the most violent particle storms of the entire space age. Had a crew been walking the lunar surface that week, or coasting home in their thin-walled command module, the dose estimates run from severe radiation sickness to potentially lethal. No crew was. The storm spent itself on an empty moon. The program rolled on, and the near miss became a footnote in the technical literature. But every Mars mission plan, written since carries that August inside it. A crew 8 months from home cannot count on being lucky for 1,000 days straight. The shelter is not a contingency, it's furniture. The second species is the one that should genuinely concern you, because it concerns the people planning Mars missions more than almost anything else. Galactic cosmic rays are not weather. They are the permanent background of the universe atomic nuclei, accelerated to near light speed by supernova explosions across the galaxy, arriving steadily from every direction forever. Most are protons, but a crucial fraction are heavy nuclei, carbon, silicon, all the way up to iron. A single iron nucleus moving at 90% of light speed carries the punch of a microscopic cannonball, and when it passes through a human body, it doesn't scatter politely, it drills, leaving a track of shattered molecules and broken DNA strands through every cell it crosses. Your body repairs most such damage it's been repairing radiation damage since life began. The question that keeps researchers up at night is what happens when the hits accumulate for years in tissue that includes the brain. We don't have to guess at the exposure because we've measured it. When NASA flew the Curiosity rover to Mars in 2011 and 2012, an instrument called RAD rode inside the capsule, soaking up exactly what a human passenger would have soaked up. The reading for the cruise: about 0.66 millisieverts per day. To put that number where you can feel it, that is roughly the dose of a chest x-ray every other day, continuing every single day of an 8 to 9 month transit, with no behavior, no diet, no caution able to lower it. By arrival, a Mars-bound astronaut on chemical propulsion has banked more radiation than most nuclear plant workers receive across an entire career, and then must fly home through the same rain. The accounting gets uncomfortable fast. NASA's current career limit for an astronaut's cumulative exposure is 600 millisieverts of effective dose, a threshold set to cap the added lifetime cancer risk. Run the arithmetic on a conjunction-class Mars mission 8 or 9 months out, 500 days on the surface, where the planet itself blocks half the sky and the thin atmosphere helps a little, 8 or 9 months home, and the round trip plausibly consumes most of a career limit in a single voyage. 1 trip, 1 career. And that calculation assumes the limits themselves are correctly set, which is, and I want to flag this, honestly, genuinely contested science. Heavy nuclei radiation barely exists at Earth's surface. Our cancer risk models are mostly extrapolated from very different exposures, like atomic bomb survivors. Some researchers argue the limits are too cautious. Others present evidence, from animal studies, that heavy ion damage to the central nervous system, to memory, to mood, to cognition may be the kind of harm we're underestimating. Nobody knows with confidence. The first Mars cruise will be, among everything else they are, data points. The obvious answer is armor, and here the rocket equation reaches out from Act 1 and slaps us all over again. Radiation shielding is mass, and every kilogram of it must be launched, accelerated, and decelerated, which costs propellant, which adds mass, which needs more shielding to protect a now bigger ship. Worse, against galactic cosmic rays, the intuitive armor betrays you. A heavy nucleus slamming into a thick aluminum hull shatters into a spray of secondary particles, so the wrong shield can actually deliver a higher dose than no shield at all. What works is hydrogen-light nuclei that absorb and fragment the incoming rounds without splintering dangerously themselves. Water is full of hydrogen. So is polyethylene plastic. So is food. So is, not to put too fine a point on it, waste. Which is why serious Mars ship designs wrap the crew quarters in the water supply, line the walls with the pantry, and arrange the mission's consumables as architecture, your drinking water doubling as your castle wall. It helps meaningfully against storms. Against cosmic rays, it only shaves the dose, because some fraction of those iron rounds will get through any wall a rocket can afford to carry. There is one more idea, and it's the elegant one. Don't block the rain, deflect it. Earth itself never blocks cosmic rays with rock. It deflects the bulk of them with its magnetic field, a planet-sized umbrella woven from moving charge. Engineers have sketched the spacecraft version for decades. Superconducting coils wrapped around the hull, generating a miniature magnetosphere that bends incoming particles away before they ever touch metal. The physics is perfectly sound. It is the same physics that paints auroras over the poles. The engineering runs into the familiar villain: coils, cryogenic cooling, and the power to feed them weigh tons. And the field needed to turn an iron nucleus moving near light speed is no gentle thing. Studies continue, quietly, in the places that study such things. File it beside fusion. Not magic, not ready, and very possibly how our grandchildren will travel inside ships that carry their own northern lights. Which brings us to the conclusion this whole part has been steering toward. And it's the punchline that welds Act 3 to everything before it. The best radiation shield ever proposed is speed. The dose is a rate multiplied by a duration, and the rate is fixed by the galaxy, but the duration belongs to the engine. Cut the transit from 9 months to 3, as a fusion-class drive promises, and you cut the cruise dose by 2/3 without launching a single extra kilogram of armor. The propulsion link and the biology link of our chain are not two separate problems. They are the same problem wearing two costumes. Every watt of plasma glowing in that shed in Bletchley is, among other things, preventive medicine. But radiation is only the loudest of the body's enemies out there, and arguably not even the strangest. Because the human machine, it turns out, doesn't merely dislike the void between worlds, it starts dismantling itself the moment it leaves home, in response to nothing more exotic than the absence of weight. Bones drain away like sandcastles in a tide. Hearts shrink. And in one of the most unsettling discoveries of the space station era, the eyes themselves, the actual shape of astronauts' eyeballs, begin to change. Gravity, it emerges, was never just the thing that holds us down. It was a prescription we'd been taking every day of our lives. Is less than break time equals 1s, is greater than number, part 9. The body and mind in freefall. Picture an astronaut floating in the cupola of the International Space Station, watching Earth roll past in serene silence. It is the most peaceful image spaceflight has ever produced. Now let me tell you what's happening inside that peaceful body. Her bones, sensing no load, have concluded they're unnecessary and are dissolving back into her bloodstream at a rate of 1 to 1.5% of bone mineral per month in the hip and spine, a pace of loss that on Earth we'd call severe. Osteoporosis, except osteoporosis takes years to do what freefall does in weeks. Her muscles, including the muscle of her aorta and the muscle of her calves, are atrophying despite the 2 hours of daily exercise that station crews perform as a non-negotiable ritual. The treadmills, the resistance machines, the bungee harnesses. The exercise doesn't stop the decay. It only slows it to a survivable rate. Her immune system is drifting towards sluggishness, while dormant viruses from her childhood chickenpox, mononucleosis, reawaken in her tissues, a phenomenon documented in astronaut after astronaut. The fluid in her body, no longer pulled toward her feet, has shifted headward, puffing her face, congesting her sinuses, and pressing, this is the unsettling one, against the backs of her eyes. That last item deserves its own paragraph, because it ambushed everyone. After years of station missions, flight surgeons began noticing that astronauts were coming home with changed eyesight, some permanently. Imaging revealed the mechanism. The headward fluid shift subtly raises pressure in the skull, and over months it physically flattens the back of the eyeball, swells the optic nerve, and wrinkles the retina's supporting layers. The condition now has a name: spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome, SANS, and a place near the top of NASA's list of Mars mission medical risks. Read that again. We are worried about sending pilots on a 3-year voyage, at the end of which their eyes may no longer focus correctly. Of all the dragons we imagined guarding the road to other planets, nobody predicted the human eyeball would be one of them. We even ran the perfect experiment, by accident, of biology. NASA astronaut Scott Kelly spent 340 days aboard the station in 2015 and 2016, while his identical twin brother, Mark, same genome, also an astronaut, stayed on Earth. Comparing the two became the famous twins study, and its results were a mixed verdict delivered in molecular handwriting. Scott returned with shifted gene expression, altered immune markers, changes in the bacterial population of his gut, and strangest of all telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that had behaved in unexpected ways. Most measures drifted back to normal within months of landing. Not all of them did. A year in freefall leaves fingerprints that don't fully wash off, and a Mars round trip is 3 times longer than Scott Kelly's mission. most of it without the station's option of coming home early. Here's what makes this entire catalogue so maddening, though. Unlike radiation, this enemy has a known, complete, almost embarrassingly simple cure. Wait. Spin the ship, or spin part of it, or tether two modules, and rotate them around their common center, and centripetal force stands in for gravity. And every one of these symptoms should simply never begin. Bones load, fluids settle, eyes hold their shape. The physics is Victorian. The concept appears in Tsiolkovsky's own notebooks. So here is one of the genuinely astonishing facts of the entire space age. In 65 years of human spaceflight, artificial gravity has been tested on a crew exactly once. In September 1966, Gemini 11, with Pete Conrad and Richard Gordon aboard, connected itself by a 30-meter tether to an uncrewed Agena rocket stage and set the pair slowly rotating, generating a centripetal pull so faint the astronauts couldn't even feel it. They only saw loose objects drift toward the wall. A whisper of synthetic weight, for a few minutes, 6 decades ago, and then never again. Not on Skylab, not on the shuttle, not on Mir, not on the station. Every gravity prescription since has been filled with treadmills and hope. If you want a single, crisp answer to tonight's title, one item, buildable with known engineering, untested for 60 years, it's this. Somebody needs to fly the spinning ship. Beyond the body's own decay sits the supply problem, and it's where biology collides head-on with Tsiolkovsky again. A human burns through roughly 5 kilograms of oxygen, water, and food per day once you count it all. Multiply by a crew of 4 and a 3-year round trip, and you get over 20 tons of consumables, every kilogram of which, remember, multiplies into many kilograms of propellant at launch. The station's answer is recycling, and it has quietly become one of the great unsung engineering triumphs of our era. In 2023, the station's water recovery system hit 98% of every 100 litres the crew uses. 98. Come back as clean drinking water, reclaimed from breath moisture, sweat, and yes, urine. Astronauts toast each other with yesterday's coffee, and the filtration is genuinely better than most municipal supplies. Oxygen gets recycled too, split from water and partially recovered from exhaled carbon dioxide. But notice the station's safety net. When a recycler breaks, and machines on a 3-year mission will break a cargo ship full of spares is months away at most. A Mars ship gets no such grace. Its loops must run, nearly closed, with onboard repairs only, for 1,000 days straight. That standard has never been demonstrated by anyone. It is, quietly, as unbuilt as the fusion engine. Food and medicine round out the manifest, and both hide problems sharper than they look. The station has grown lettuce, radishes, and chili peppers in small experimental chambers, morale-boosting, photogenic, and nutritionally a rounding error. No crew has ever fed itself in space, and a Mars ship's galley will still be overwhelmingly packaged mass, engineered to survive years of storage. The quieter problem is the pharmacy. Many medications degrade over months, radiation accelerates that chemistry, and a 3-year mission means the antibiotics, the anesthetics, and the cardiac drugs all age alongside the crew, with no pharmacy stop available past the moon. Studies of medical kits returned from the station have found a meaningful fraction of drugs losing potency ahead of schedule. It is the least cinematic item in tonight's checklist, and a mission could genuinely hinge on it. The first interplanetary cruise will need either a deliberate tolerance for expired medicine or a way to make fresh. And then there is the cargo that cannot be recycled, resupplied, or repaired with a wrench: the mind. Earth has run dress rehearsals, 6 volunteers, sealed in a Moscow facility for 520 days in the Mars 500 study. Crews spending months in a dome on a Hawaiian volcano for the high seas missions, and the findings are consistent and humbling. The crew survive. Cooperation mostly holds, but sleep degrades, tempers fray over absurdities, and some crew members slide into a withdrawal the researchers called psychological hibernation. Now add the ingredient no Earth analog can simulate: the view. A real Mars crew will watch Earth shrink from a world to a marble to simply the brightest star out the window. They'll experience the com delay we met in Part 1, up to 22 minutes each way, 44 round trip, which doesn't just make conversation impossible. It abolishes rescue, abolishes Houston fixes it, abolishes the entire psychological architecture of someone is watching over us that has cradled every crew since Mercury. The ship must carry its own authority, its own medicine, its own morale. The crew of a Mars ship won't be explorers with a support team. They'll be, in the fullest sense humans have ever experienced, alone. So the passenger problem stands like this: a body that dissolves without weight, a dose that climbs without speed, loops that must close without resupply, and minds that must hold without Earth. Every one of those clauses bends back toward the same two remedies. We keep meeting better ships and shorter trips. And you can hear how this act has really been Act 2, wearing scrubs. The engine is the medicine. The architecture is the immune system. But there's a third remedy hiding in the list, and it's the one that transforms everything from heroics into a civilization. Because so far, every gram of water, fuel, food, and shielding in our story has been hauled up from the bottom of Earth's gravity well at exponential cost. What if it didn't have to be? What if the fuel was already out there, frozen in the floors of craters that haven't seen sunlight in 2 billion years, and floating, 95% pure, in the air of Mars itself? In 2021, a machine the size of a toaster, bolted inside a rover, quietly performed a magic trick on another planet. It breathed Martian air and exhaled oxygen. 8 grams of it in an hour, barely a breath. It may eventually be remembered the way we remember the first transistor. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number. Part 10, Living Off the Land. Let's return one final time to the tyrant of Part 2, because hidden inside the rocket equation is an assumption so obvious that nobody states it out loud, and breaking that assumption is the single most powerful move available to our species. The assumption is this: everything comes from Earth. Every drop of propellant, every litre of water, every gram of oxygen for the entire round trip, hauled up the steepest gravity hill in the inner solar system, multiplied by the exponential at every stage. The equation's tyranny was never really about rockets. It was about logistics, about a supply chain with exactly one warehouse, located at the bottom of the deepest hole in the neighborhood. Open a second warehouse anywhere else, and the mathematics doesn't just improve, it deflates. The technical term is in situ resource utilization, living off the land, and the moment it stopped being theory has a date and a sound. In April 2021, aboard the Perseverance rover in Jezero Crater, a gold-plated box about the size of a car battery called Moxie switched on, drew in the Martian atmosphere, which is 95% carbon dioxide, and electrochemically cracked those molecules apart, exhaling pure oxygen onto another world. The quantities were almost comically humble. Over 2 years of intermittent runs, about 122 grams of oxygen total, peaking at 12 grams per hour, roughly what a modest houseplant manages. But Moxie was never about quantity. It was an existence proof, the first time in 4.5 billion years that the raw material of one planet was industrially converted by machinery from another. The first transistor switched a trickle of current and looked like a toy. 20 years later, transistors ran the world. The chemistry that scales this up was worked out in the 19th century by Paul Sabatier, and it is beautiful in its simplicity. Take carbon dioxide, Mars's atmosphere, free everywhere. Add hydrogen, obtained by splitting water ice, which Mars stores in quantity beneath its mid-latitudes and at its poles. Run them over a nickel catalyst with some heat, and out come methane and water. Methane plus oxygen, which you also get from splitting that water, is rocket propellant. Now connect a dot that's been waiting since part 2. When SpaceX designed the Raptor engine, it chose methane over the more efficient hydrogen, a choice that puzzled some observers at the time. But methane was never about performance in Earth's sky. Starship burns methane because Mars makes methane. The vehicle's fuel choice is a bet, cast in engine hardware, that the Sabatier reaction will one day run at industrial scale in Jezero-coloured dirt. The return propellant for the first cruise is intended to come not from Earth, but from the destination's own air and ice. The prospecting for that ice is already decades along, and the results keep improving. Orbiters mapping hydrogen from above have found the signature of buried water across wide bands of the Martian mid-latitudes. Radar sounders have traced what appear to be genuine glaciers, sheets of ice, insulated under a skin of rock and dust at latitudes mild enough for a crew to work in. Some estimates put the accessible ice in ranges that would supply settlements for centuries. And the first crews won't be melting permafrost over camp stoves. The plans are industrial robotic propellant plants sent ahead on earlier windows, powered by compact reactors descended from that kilopower test we met in part 5, quietly filling the return tanks for months before any boot touches the dust. The gas station gets built before the customers arrive. It has to. Why does that matter so much? Run the numbers on the alternative. Hauling your return propellant to Mars means accelerating hundreds of tons of methane and oxygen across interplanetary space propellant to push propellant, the snake eating its tail again, roughly doubling or worse, what must depart Earth orbit. Make the return fuel on Mars, and the outbound ship flies effectively one-way loaded, crew, cargo, and an empty return tank, trusting the filling station at the far end. Mission mass estimates drop by half or more with that single change of assumption. No engine we discussed tonight, not Nerva, not Fusion, delivers a bigger single saving than simply not carrying the trip home with you. The Moon plays the same game with different cards. At its poles lie craters whose floors, by a quirk of the Moon's barely tilted axis, have not been touched by sunlight in upwards of 2 billion years, among the coldest places yet measured in the solar system, colder than the surface of Pluto. And in that permanent dark, spacecraft after spacecraft has confirmed the signature of water ice, billions of tons of it, by some estimates, mixed into the soil. Water is the most valuable substance in spaceflight. Drink it, breathe it once split, and split into hydrogen and oxygen. Burn it as the highest performing chemical propellant we know. Now recall the geography of gravity from part 2. Lifting a kilogram off Earth costs 9.4 kilometers per second of delta V. Lifting that kilogram off the Moon costs about 2.4, and there's no atmosphere in the way. The Moon isn't merely a destination. It is a fuel depot stationed near the top of Earth's gravity hill, 3 days from home, stocked over the eons by comet impacts. Whoever learns to mine those dark craters isn't winning the Moon. They're winning the supply chain of the entire inner solar system. Notice what water actually is in mission architecture terms, because it took planners a surprisingly long time to see it whole. The same tank of water is, simultaneously, the crew's drinking supply, their breathable oxygen, once electrolysis splits it, their rocket propellant, once that hydrogen and oxygen are liquefied. And recall the lesson of Act 3, their radiation armor, parked in the walls between the bunks and the cosmic rain. One substance, 4 mission-critical roles. Every kilogram of ice pulled from a crater shadow or a Martian glacier serves the biology link and the propulsion link of our chain at the same moment. There is a reason every serious map of humanity's future in space is, at bottom, a map of where the water is. which brings the idea down to the hardware being tested this very year. A propellant depot is simply a tank in orbit, a gas station floating at the top of the hill, and it changes every mission that visits one. We've already glimpsed the headline case. A Starship refilled in low Earth orbit commands, more Delta V sitting there, full, than a Saturn V could deliver from the launch pad. The same hull that struggles to orbit with mostly empty tanks becomes, once refueled, a vehicle that can throw 100 tons at the Moon or Mars. Nothing about the ship changed except where it bought its gas. That is the entire revolution. In one sentence, the rocket equation resets at every filling station. Look one shelf further out, and the supply chain gets stranger and better. Carbonaceous asteroids, the dark, primitive kind, can run to 10 or 20% water by mass, locked in clays, alongside carbon and nitrogen. The complete grocery list of life support, drifting in gravity wells so shallow that leaving costs almost nothing. And the metal ones are stranger still, Psyche. The world that spacecraft from Part 5 is chasing right now appears to be an exposed planetary core, a flying mountain range of nickel and iron. Asteroid mining sits today roughly where Moxie sat 20 years ago, studied, costed, undemonstrated. But the direction of travel is the entire point of this act every year. A little more of the mission mass list migrates from the column marked. Launch it from Earth to the column marked, it's already up there. Honesty requires naming the unglamorous dragons guarding this treasure, because they're real. Cryogenic propellants, liquid oxygen, liquid methane, sit near minus 180 degrees Celsius and want desperately to boil away. Parking them in orbit for weeks or months without unacceptable boil-off is an unsolved engineering fight involving sun shields, insulation, and active recooling that nobody has yet run at scale. And filling one depot takes many tanker flights. Current estimates run around 10 launches to fill a single ship for a lunar landing, which demands a launch cadence the industry is only beginning to approach. These are not reasons for doubt. They are the actual frontier, the specific welds being made on this link of the chain right now. The ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstration is targeted for this year, 2026. When that quiet plumbing test succeeds, 2 steel ships docked nose-to-nose in orbit, cryogenic liquid flowing between them, it will make fewer headlines than any astronaut, and it will matter more than most missions. It is the moment travel between planets stops being a voyage you pack for and starts being a network you ride. And networks, once you start thinking in networks, produce an idea so elegant it borders on poetry, a ship that never stops. A ship that leaves Earth once and then commutes between worlds forever without burning another drop. It exists on paper, it obeys mechanics we've already met tonight, and it was worked out in detail by the second man ever to stand on the Moon. Is less than break time equals 1s, is greater than number, part 11, the Eternal Ferries. After Buzz Aldrin came home from Tranquility Base, he went back to school in his own words, back to the orbital mechanics that had been his doctoral specialty at MIT before anyone had heard his name. And in the 1980s, he worked out the details of an idea that may yet carry more humans to Mars than any rocket, the cycler. Here is the insight. We've spent all night paying Delta V to start and stop ships, accelerate at Earth, decelerate at Mars, accelerate at Mars, decelerate at Earth, every leg purchased from the tyrant at exponential prices. But orbits, once established, are free forever. So, place a large vehicle on a carefully chosen ellipse around the Sun, one shaped so that it swings past Earth, coasts out, swings past Mars, and returns, with small gravity nudges from each flyby, keeping the rhythm, and that vehicle will commute between the 2 planets indefinitely. No engine, no fuel. A moving train that never breaks, crossing between worlds on schedule for decades, powered by nothing but the geometry it was given on day 1. The passengers, of course, still have to catch it. As the cycler sweeps past Earth and it does not slow down for you, a small taxicraft must sprint out and match its speed, dock, and transfer crew aboard for the months-long crossing, then undock near Mars and break into orbit while the great ship sails on. All the violent, expensive, equation-cursed acceleration is confined to the small taxi. The heavy thing never pays for speed again. And it's precisely the heaviness that makes the idea sing, because look what it does to Act 3. Every miserable trade-off we found in the passenger problem, shielding too massive to accelerate, spin gravity structures too bulky to launch on every mission, greenhouses, gyms, redundant recyclers, the entire architecture of keeping humans whole. All of it stops being penalized the moment the vehicle carrying it never has to change velocity again. You build the castle once, fling it onto its eternal ellipse, and from then on, physics maintains it for free. The cycler is where the propulsion link and the biology link of our chain finally stop fighting each other. Aldrin spent decades refining the trajectories. They work. What the concept has been waiting for 40 years is a launch industry capable of assembling castle-sized objects in space at survivable cost. The rehearsal hall for all of this is being built right now, in an orbit you've probably never heard of. The Gateway, a small station NASA and its partners are assembling to fly a long, looping path around the moon, will be the first crewed outpost to live entirely outside Earth's magnetic shelter. Soaking in the genuine interplanetary radiation environment of Act 3, days from rescue instead of hours. It is, candidly, a controversial project. Critics call it a toll booth, supporters call it a shipyard, but notice what it actually is in the terms of tonight's chain, a place to practice. Long-duration habitation in the real environment, dockings, refuelings, crew handoffs, every skill a Mars vehicle needs, rehearsed 3 days from home. Civilizations don't leap from doorstep to continent. They build the harbour first. Which is exactly why the most important chart in spaceflight isn't a trajectory at all, it's a price curve. In the space shuttle era, putting 1 kilogram into low Earth orbit cost on the order of $54,500. The Falcon 9, with its reusable first stage landing on barges, pulled that to roughly $2,700 per kilogram, a 20-fold collapse inside a generation. Starship's stated ambition, and it is an ambition, not yet a delivered fact, is full reusability, driving the figure below a few $100s, conceivably below 100. Every threshold that Curve crosses resurrects a fleet of ideas that were never wrong, merely priced out. Depots, cyclers, spin gravity ships, lunar mines. We've already watched the Curve kill once tonight. To recall that Draco, the nuclear engine revival, was cancelled in 2025, not because reactors stopped working, but because falling launch prices made brute force refueled chemical look like better value per dollar. You may notice that the same Curve that buried the Elegant engine is simultaneously funding the depots, the tankers, and eventually the castle ships. Cheap mass to orbit is the tide that decides which boats float. Right now, it is rising faster than at any moment in the history of spaceflight. If you want to know what routine looks like when it finally arrives, aviation already showed us on almost exactly this timetable. In June of 1919, Alcock and Brown crossed the Atlantic non-stop for the first time, 14 hours of fog, ice on the wings, and a crash landing nose first into an Irish bog. It was heroic, barely survivable, and utterly unrepeatable as a service. 39 years later, in 1958, the first transatlantic jets entered scheduled service, and crossing an ocean became something you did with a newspaper in your lap. Nobody passed a law. No single invention flipped the switch. The bog landing era became the timetable era through thousands of unglamorous improvements, compounding engines, weather routing, navigation, fuel logistics. Interplanetary travel in 2026 is somewhere in its bog landing decade. The encouraging news is what the precedent says comes next, and roughly how fast it comes. Read this year's strangest headline through that lens, and it stops being strange. In February 2026, Elon Musk, the loudest Mars voice of this century, the man whose company exists by charter to colonize that planet, announced that Mars would wait 5 to 7 more years, while SpaceX concentrated on the Moon. Starship's 12 flights have included 5 failures. The tanker cadence is unproven. The Artemis contracts are signed, and the Moon is 3 days away, a place where every technology in tonight's checklist, from cryogenic depots to ice mining to long-duration life support, can be rehearsed with a survivable abort option. The pivot disappointed millions of people. But trace the logic of everything we've assembled tonight, and it reads differently. It is what choosing the supply chain over the stunt looks like. The lesson of 57 years stuck at the Moon's distance was that flags and footprints doesn't compound, infrastructure compounds. Even the most impatient actor in the field just bet his timeline on it. It's worth hearing the skeptics clearly here, because their argument is quantitative and serious. A single, fully fueled interplanetary starship needs on the order of 10 tanker flights. A 5-ship Mars squadron departing in one window implies 50 or more launches inside a few months, sustained tanker turnaround, and cryogenic depots holding their cold for weeks, none of which has been demonstrated at even a tenth of that scale. Boil-off, the slow evaporation of super-cold propellant, quietly taxes every depot like interest on a debt. The supporters' answer is also quantitative. The same company already flies its smaller rocket at a cadence well over 100 launches a year that was called impossible a decade ago, and cadence, unlike physics, has repeatedly yielded to practice. Both sides agree on what would settle it. The demonstrations scheduled in pieces for this very year. Rarely does a debate this large get an answer this soon, so tally the network as it stands in 2026. Flying today, reusable heavy boosters, surface-to-orbit costs in freefall, station-keeping recyclers at 98%, ion freight with 20 years of service records. In test this year, ship-to-ship cryogenic transfer, long-duration orbital storage, Starship version 3, fusion exhaust plasma in Bletchley, plasma reconnection jets in California. On paper, waiting for the price curve, depots at the Lagrange points, lunar ice refineries, Aldrin's eternal ferries with their castle walls of water, none of it complete. All of it, and this is the point of the entire evening, all of it in motion at once, for the first time ever, every link of the chain glowing somewhere on some anvil, which leaves us exactly one job for our final few minutes together. Assemble the honest checklist, answer the question in the title plainly, and ask when. Is less than break time equals 1s? Is greater than? Number, part 12, the checklist. We open tonight with 4 astronauts splashing into the Pacific, holders of a distance record that should embarrass us, and a question, what would it actually take to travel between the planets of our solar system? Not as a stunt, as a thing our species simply does. We've spent 2 hours gathering the answer piece by piece, so let's finally lay it on the table in plain language, link by link, the way an engineer would, what we have, what we're testing, what's missing. Here is what humanity already has, flying, today. We have heavy, reusable launch vehicles and a cost per kilogram curve collapsing faster than any energy price in industrial history. We have whisper engines, ion and Hall thrusters, with 2 decades of operational records and the all-time Delta V crown, ready to serve as the freight tier of any future network. We have closed-loop life support, running at 98% water recovery on the station, continuously crewed for a quarter century. We have proof, 122 grams of it, that the air of another planet can be turned into breathable oxygen by a machine we sent. And as of this April, we have reproven after 54 years that we can send humans to lunar distance and bring them home. Stack those capabilities, and you can read the title's answer in a single breath. Cheap mass to orbit, refueling in space. Fast engines for people, patient engines for freight, water and spin for the body, shelters for the storms. Fuel manufactured at the destination instead of carried from home. Ferries that, once launched, never stop. 7 items, and not one of them requires new physics. Every entry is either flying, in test, or sitting in a filing cabinet with a full-power test record from before your parents were born. That is the strangest property of tonight's entire question. It is the rarest kind of grand challenge, the kind where the universe has already said yes and is simply waiting on the paperwork. Here is what's on the test stand, this year and next. Ship-to-ship cryogenic propellant transfer, the quiet plumbing demonstration that turns missions into a network, is targeted for 2026. Long-duration orbital flight of Starship version 3, with its docking ports and refueling plumbing, likewise. Fusion exhaust plasma achieved first light in Bletchley in March, with an orbital demonstration of the core technology aimed at 2027, and Helicity's reconnection jets are scheduled to fire this year. The Moon, 3 days away, is being instrumented as the rehearsal stage for every one of these systems, which is what February's Mars postponement, read honestly, actually was. The network beating the stunt. And here is what's missing: the honest gaps, the unforged links. There is no funded fast crew engine anywhere on Earth. Nerva is 50 years buried, Draco was cancelled in 2025, and fusion tugs remain startups with plasma and promises. So for now, any crew that goes the slow way, paying the full biological price of 9 months each direction. Artificial gravity, the complete known cure for the body's dissolution in freefall, has not been tested on humans since a 30-meter tether experiment in 1966. Somebody, someday soon, simply has to fly the spinning ship. Life support has never run 3 years without a resupply lifeline. And the radiation question, whether the heavy ion rain damages human minds more than our models admit, will not be settled by any laboratory. It will be settled by the first crews, who will be experiment and explorer at once. And there is a quieter item missing from the list, one no engineer can supply: a paying reason. Apollo had a geopolitical customer, and when the customer was satisfied, the program died. That is the lesson of the 57-year pause, stated plainly. What's different now, and it is genuinely different, is that space has begun generating its own revenue. Communications, constellations, profitable enough to fund rocket development out of cash flow, launch services with commercial backlogs years long and further out, but no longer laughable, the resource economics of Act 4. A transport network survives only if something needs transporting. The first sustainable traffic between worlds probably won't be explorers at all. It will be propellant, cargo, and data freight first, passengers after, exactly the unromantic order in which every transport network in human history has actually been built. So when? You've earned a straight answer, and I'll give you one flagged, clearly, as projection rather than prophecy, because every date in spaceflight history has slipped. The late 2020s, if the transfer demonstrations succeed, belong to orbital refueling becoming routine and the first uncrewed heavy landings on Mars cargo, habitats, and Sabatier plants sent ahead to make propellant before any human follows. The 2030s plausibly hold the first crewed Mars attempts, 3-year conjunction missions. The hard way, by crews who will absorb the doses and prove the loops, alongside the first fusion tug demonstrations and the first serious lunar propellant operations. And the 2040s and beyond, if the curve keeps falling and the castles get built, hold the beginning of the thing the title actually asked about: schedules. Cyclers on their eternal ellipses, depots with regular customers, the solar system not as a frontier, but as a place with timetables. Let yourself picture the ride itself for a moment, because someone is going to take it. You board not at a launch pad, but at a depot, an orbital terminal. Your brief hop from the surface reached in under an hour, and the ship waiting at the gate has never touched a planet and never will. The departure burn, when it comes, is gentle. The long middle of the trip passes under spin gravity, in quarters walled with water tanks, the cosmic rain ticking harmlessly into the plumbing around your bunk. Somewhere in the second month, you notice that the pale dot ahead has become a disk, and then a world with weather. The crossing that consumed 9 months and a career's radiation budget in the era this video was made takes you a few quiet weeks. To you, the whole thing will feel unremarkable. That is the entire achievement. Routine is the monument. Notice, one last time, what was never on the missing list: physics. Nothing in tonight's checklist requires a discovery. The equation has loopholes we know how to exploit. The engines have designs that have run at full power. The cures for the body are Victorian mechanics. The fuel is already out there, frozen in dark craters and floating in foreign air, waiting like groceries on shelves. 3 times this century, and last, we built or designed the engines that would have opened the planets Nerva, Orion, Draco, and 3 times we set them down, for budgets, for treaties, for spreadsheets. Never once because the universe said no. The chain between us and the planets has only ever been forged exactly as fast as we chose to forge it. That is either the most damning fact in the history of exploration, or the most hopeful one, because choices, unlike physics, can change in a single budget cycle, a single demonstration, a single generation deciding it's tired of waiting. And consider, as you drift towards sleep, what's waiting on the far side of that choice. A species that can move freely between its planets is not the same species that cannot. It is backed up against catastrophe. It is supplied by asteroids instead of strip mines. It raises children who think of Jupiter's moons the way you think of another continent far. Yes, expensive, certainly, but reachable, served by scheduled departures, printed in tomorrow's timetables. The first person to board such a flight to shuffle down a boarding tunnel toward a ship bound for another world, ticket in hand, unremarkable as a Tuesday, that person has very probably already been born. They may be learning to walk right now, somewhere, tonight. And when they finally take their seat and feel the ferry slip its orbit, they won't be asking what it took. They'll be asking what we were waiting for.